Hello and welcome to the garden. Well, it's been another beautiful day here. Almost blue sky, it's coming over a bit hazy now, but it's been really rather warm and just cut the lawn for the first time. Although lawn's probably the wrong word for what we've got. It's some scrubby old grass. But anyway, I thought I'd take advantage of the nice weather, show you a couple of things in the garden here, looking at a few points regarding the fruit trees, and just a waffle video today. I'm not going to be doing any work on them, just thought I'd point out a couple of things because they're looking very nice in flower at the moment. Anyway, the rain is coming tonight, or forecast tonight, so I thought I'd make this video today while we've got the nice weather. The first thing I'd like to show you is straight behind me. It's this beautiful young plum. So this is a very nice specimen of Coe's Golden Drop, and one of the things I talk about a lot in my pruning videos is the benefit of laying branches down, trying to avoid vertical wood like this useless piece here, which I will probably prune back. I don't think I want it. Obviously you don't prune the stone fruits in the winter, so I could probably prune this anywhere now. After bud break, it's fine to make formative cuts, otherwise later in the summer is good. But of course with a fan, obviously you start by laying all the branches down, so that's normal, but the principle applies to whatever you're developing. Vertical wood, as I said in a video not that long ago, tends to be more vigorous, give you more growth, but a lot less productive. And here you see a great example of it. All of these branches that have been laid down are covered with blossom, and well, the plums will fruit on these short spurs here. They're not especially long-lived, and at some point you have to think about renewing old wood as it becomes unproductive, but it will fruit for some years quite happily along all of this wood. It's not like with the peaches where you have to renew it every year because they only fruit on 1-year-old wood. But this is exactly what you get when you lay a branch down. Not only do you get potentially a lot of fruit, you also get a great bud break all the way along the branch. So if you have something more vertical like this piece, you tend to get a few shoots forming near the top, and you might get very poor break further down. That's quite important when you're developing cordons, for example. You need spur systems to be developing in the bottom part of the main stem as well as up the top. So sometimes you have to shorten those stems to encourage reasonable bud break further down. But this is what you're getting when you lay those branches down. And this is more or less the perfect outcome here. I mean, they always vary. They don't look like they should. They don't look like they've come off the pages of a book. You have to deal with the wood that the tree wants to produce. But I've been very fortunate here in that we've got great formations of fruit buds all the way along, right from the base of this wood, and that's really great to see. So I always like to do the pruning videos, and they've been some of the most watched videos on my channel, and I suppose that's because it's one of the most difficult aspects of the kitchen garden. You can find plenty of videos on growing veg, far fewer that deal with pruning and training in any detail. There's still lots of great information out there, especially if you look at some of the work being done by research establishments who are trialing different pruning and training regimes. You can find a wealth of great information, but for the sort of pruning and training we do in the kitchen garden, it's not so widely covered. And then also it tends to be done very often, I think, in such a way that somebody will tell you where to cut, but you're left at the end going, okay, but now I've got a tree in front of me that looks a little bit different, and I don't really understand why I'm supposed to be cutting in a particular way. So that does make a huge difference. The why is everything. And I like to say that there are two keys to understanding pruning. On the one hand, you've got, obviously, you've got stuff that is common across a wide range, if not all, of the fruit trees we grow in the garden. And that covers, obviously there's some basic techniques of where and how to cut with secateurs or saws, and you often see some naughty things. So there'll be a bud somewhere and somebody's cutting an inch above the bud, and that bit of stem is going to die back, and little things like that to do with the technique and the proper way to make cuts with a pruning saw so that you don't damage the wood and so on. So there's the techniques, but then there's the big thing, which is understanding how a tree is going to respond to your interventions. And that can be all sorts of things. When you shorten a branch in the winter, the response is going to be different from shortening a branch in the summer. And then if you're laying a branch down, that has a particular effect as well. And then whether you should be cutting a branch back just a little bit, not at all, or back to the base, whether you need to be renewing branches and so on, all of those things, understanding how a tree is going to respond to whatever you propose to do to it. That's one aspect. And the other one is the bit that can cause some confusion, because pruning a peach, for example, is not the same as pruning an apple. And that's because they have different fruiting habits. All of those other things are the same. The pruning techniques are the same. The more or less how a tree responds to oh, excuse me, how a tree responds to some sort of pruning intervention or bending of branches, those things tend to be the same. But how you should then go about pruning a particular fruit tree depends generally on the particular fruit, but very often on the variety as well. So with apples and pears to a slightly lesser extent, you've got the difference between, sorry, the geese are flying by and they are noisy blighters. You've got the difference between spur bearing and tip bearing varieties. So if you prune them in the same way, if you prune a tip bearer in the same way as you would a spur bearer, you're going to cut all the fruit buds off. So those things you need to be aware of, and peaches and sour cherries, you need to be aware that they bear only on the 1-year-old wood. So once something's fruited on one of the peaches, that wood's not going to fruit again. You have to cut that out and replace it with some new wood. So that's the bit where a lot of confusion can come from, and the different ways we have to prune different trees are all about understanding where what the different fruiting habits are, where you're going to get productive wood. Because okay, if you just plant a tree and let it grow in a natural way, it will just do its thing. But most of the time we're trying to control the amount of space it takes up, and we're trying to, within that envelope, we're trying to maximize the vigor and health and productivity of the plant. So all of that needs to be managed. In order to do that, we need to produce lots of fruiting wood. There's some wood on a tree that's there as part of the structure, the framework of the tree. But as much as possible, you want to be good, productive wood. And actually the example I've got behind me is an interesting one. This is a sweet cherry, and in the fruit cage here, I've been growing these, trying to grow them as UFOs, these upright fruiting offshoots. And I've never tried this method before, so I think I'm trying to remember when we put these in. We did have a few cherries off of each of these last season. They must have gone in the year before, so they'll be in their third season. We're going to get a much bigger crop off of them this year, but they're still a work in progress. They've got a few years to go before they sort of fill out this space. Now this method is a little bit different. So normally I say we don't want vertical wood if we can avoid it. It's much better to have a branch that's laid down to the horizontal, or take some side shoots off at angles, and that vertical wood is not our friend. And that's very often true, because the vertical wood, it's mostly interested in growing, it's going to be overly vigorous, and it tends not to be very productive. This method actually exploits the vertical wood. You do start by taking the main stem and dropping that down pretty low. It's almost horizontal on some of these. The angle varies a little bit depending on how the trunk has gone, but it's not quite horizontal, but it's laid down at a low angle, and then I've got these shoots coming off, and the idea is that they come off at regular intervals. And cherries have an annoying growth habit. They're pretty vertical and they're pretty vigorous, so that's not ideal if you want to develop a compact tree in your garden and it's shooting up high. That's just not handy. It's much better if it's a more modest vigor with a spreading habit, and it's easier to deal with. But sweet cherries are a bit of a problem. Sour cherries are much better behaved, except that they then need renewal pruning because they tend not to fruit on the old wood. But the idea here is that we spread the vigor out amongst a whole row of these vertical stems, and that none of these come to dominate too much. But anyway, the thing I wanted to show you on here is where on the sweet cherry you're going to find a huge cluster of flowers. So two of the sweet cherries have started to flower now. The others, well, there's some nice fat buds, but they haven't quite broken yet. And indeed, most of these haven't. So you can see all these fat buds here. These are all flowers, and we're going to be inundated in this area. And of course, with cherries, the fruit's so small you don't have to thin them. So hopefully we get a whole lot of fruit here. It does depend on the weather. At the moment it's lovely and the pollinators can get to them. We've seen some bumblebees around today. It's been quite warm, so it's been a good day for pollination, but we've got some grotty weather on the forecast, which is unfortunate. But you can see there's this huge collection of blossoms in this particular area, and the reason is that you won't be able to see it, I don't think, on the camera, but you can see, well, you can't see, but this is where the 1-year-old wood starts. So this is the end of the branch last season, and this is 1-year-old wood, this is 2-year-old wood, and the cherries will fruit on these short spurs on the 2-year-old wood, very similar to plums really. But then we get this huge collection of blossom around the base of 1-year-old wood, and this is where sweet cherries are potentially immensely productive. And there are training regimes that will look to maximize this collection of blossom, and it's similar all the way along. So this is another branch that I think had got this far last season. This is now new wood. This is the old wood. You can see perhaps a slight colour difference, but again, at the base of the 1-year-old wood we've got this big collection of blossom. I think this was as far as the main stem had travelled last spring, so this is all new last year. Of course we've got nothing along here, and this was also new Well, we got a couple of flowers there, but essentially that's bare. But this will fruit next season a lot more. But down here we've got the base of the 1-year-old wood again, and it is covered. So there are some things that we should do every time we prune to look after the health of plants, removing crossing wood, crowded areas, disease, damaged wood, stuff like that. But putting that aside, that's stuff that we have to do for the health of the plant. What we're trying to do is maximize our productivity, and that means understanding where and when on a particular tree we're going to get a crop. And it depends it does depend on the pruning regime. There are some schemes for cherries that aim to maximize these sorts of clusters of flowers. This isn't one of them, although what will happen is when I get up to here, obviously I've got to stop them there. I could carry on up the angles. The reason we got a sloping roof on the fruit cage, of course, this is an old polytunnel frame. It works quite well, but if you've got vertical sides on a fruit cage, you can just go on straight up to the top, but it would be a little bit higher than this, I think. But anyway, I'm planning to just take it up to here and then pinch out the top. And at some point, the established growth, although it will fruit on the older wood, it's not going to be as productive, and that old wood over time becomes fairly unproductive. So the idea then would be to cut back a portion of the branches fairly low down, quite close to the base, make a stub cut there and take up new shoots. And of course, with those new shoots, I'm going to be producing more of that 1-year-old wood, and at the base of that 1-year-old wood, I'm going to get those lovely collections of blossom. I do have a problem with one of these, and this is the trick with the UFO approach. I'm going to have to do a little bit of work. I haven't decided when I'm going to make the cuts yet. Not yet, because we're only right at the very beginning of bud break, and I don't want to prune anything with these quite yet, but I'll show you the problem. So this one at a glance looks okay. However, we've got a problem with this piece of wood at the very least. This one's not too bad. This is perfect. This is really what we want to see. And again, there's the joint between 2-year-old and 1-year-old wood. So we hadn't got very far last season. And again, we've got the cluster of blossoms here. This is not as productive as the neighbouring variety yet, but we'll have to see how this develops over time. It may be that it never becomes quite as productive. Depends on the variety. But we will see. These have got some years to go before they're really established. But this piece of wood is quite nice. The diameter of it, in relation to the main stem here, it's not too bad. It's maybe around about 1/3 of the diameter, and that's fine. This one here, well, it's approaching, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of the diameter, and this is far too vigorous. So the idea here is to try and get a more even growth across the length of this stem, and to deal with excessively vigorous stems like this. And this is not because it's vertical, because the neighbours are also pretty vertical, but it's just this one has taken off. It was happened to be the most vigorous of those shoots at the time. That's the joint between 2-year-old and 1-year-old, and again we've got a little cluster of blossom there. But I'm going to have to do something with this, and the idea is that we cut this low down, probably down here, could be there, but I think probably here, and we take off at least 2 side shoots then, and we hope that by taking off a couple of shoots here, they're going to turn out weaker than this one great big fat one. But in any event, I think I need to cut this somewhere. I want a little bit of time to think about it, not just where I'm cutting, but when. I mean, ideally, I'd like to take that crop and then cut it, but I'm not sure at this point whether it might be better to cut this in a few weeks' time after we've had proper bud break, and then take these new branches up, and hopefully they won't take too much of the sap, so we get a couple of weaker growing specimens here. It's going to be a little bit crowded here. Eventually I might have to take one of them out, but I certainly want to leave at least two to start with. I'm much more likely to get weaker growth then. But this is the only thing you've got to be a little bit careful with, because this branch could turn into a bit of a nightmare. These others here, they're much thinner, and that's much better for this particular scheme. So the final one I want to look at is this fig behind me, and I think undoubtedly amongst all the fruit trees one would commonly grow in an orchard or kitchen garden in the UK, the fig is the most interesting. Reproduction in figs is fascinating, the way the fruit is formed, and pollination with the fig wasps and so on. And maybe I'll talk about that in another video. I won't bore you with that today. Of course, we're not interested in pollination with the figs. The only ones we grow here for fruit are the parthenocarpic sorts. They produce their fruit without needing pollination. So there are a few things like that in the kitchen garden. I mean, most fruit that swells in response to hormones and so on that are produced after this pollination. So no pollination, no fruit. That's not true of a few things, like glasshouse cucumbers are like that. They don't need or indeed don't want to be pollinated. Figs are incapable of being pollinated in this country because we don't have their pollinator, the fig wasp. If you have a look at a fig, actually, as a fruit, it's pretty unusual. It's really an inside-out flower, so all of the flowers are inside, pointing to the inside of the fruit. And you know, if you get figs, especially dried figs, from their more natural environment, they can be a little bit gritty because they've got seeds in. You won't get them with these sorts of parthenocarpic varieties that we have here, because there's no seeds, because they're not pollinated. But it's an inside-out flower, and it's just a fascinating structure. And then the life cycle of the fig wasp, and everything about the fig is fascinating. But anyway, this is another one that can be a bit of a pain. And what you find is, very often if you go to an old garden where there's, you know, an ancient fig tree, typically it's got huge long branches with nothing happening. There's no new side shoots appearing, there's no leaves, there's no fruit, and all of it is on the outside. And that's the growth and fruiting habit of the fig. So there are some oddities amongst the varieties, but generally speaking, the figs are capable of producing 2 crops in 1 year. Now, if they're grown outdoors, you're only likely to get the first crop, known as the braver crop. And that's the ones that, well, there are 1 or 2 on these plants right now. The later crop, the main crop, typically you won't get that ripe outdoors. In a greenhouse here in the south, we get both crops each season, which is very nice. And it's a good reason to put a fig in a greenhouse or a polytunnel. So these have great big long bare branches, and really they need to be cut back regularly. Lots of hacking back on the fig. I think of all the trees here, the fig responds far better than anything else to harsh pruning. It doesn't care. It will shoot from the most unpromising stump, and it will happily respond to being hacked right back to the base. And that's something I've done quite regularly to try and tame them here. And another thing is you need to ideally try and restrict their root growth. These are placed in tubs. They're big tubs, but I have a feeling at least one of these has managed to break out of the tub somewhere. But if you don't cut these back a lot, you're going to end up with the usual bare branches. So you want to, when they're actively growing, don't let it go too far before pinching back, and then hopefully you'll get some side shoots. And the older wood that's fruited, cut it right back hard near the base to allow new growth to come up, because it's only this bit of growth here from there up that's going to do anything for us. All of this stuff below, I'm not going to get any leaves, I'm not going to get any fruit, and in all likelihood, until I cut this branch back, I'm not going to get any side shoots. So this is one of the most frustrating things to try and keep in an orderly fashion, because there's little or no permanent framework. You can't fan it out neatly across the space, because especially in a space like this, it's not huge. It's a nice big space for me, but for a fig it's not huge, and it does require regular and hard pruning. But anyway, these two crops, the first crop, it forms near the tips of the growth from last, I suppose, last midsummer onwards, they might start to form, and only on that wood that was growing then, this very end here, will you get any young fruitlets develop. And they overwinter as sort of pea-sized fruitlets. And the reason you might lose them if the tree is outdoors is they're not that hardy. So if you want to make sure that you get these fruits, it's a good idea to protect them from the cold weather. You can wrap some fleece around them. You don't have to protect the tree itself necessarily, but certainly locally where the fruitlets are, because they're very easily damaged by cold spells during the winter. And if you lose those, you're probably not going to get a crop outdoors, because then what happens is the new growth that's just starting here now, that extension growth from about now, of course, spring through to early-ish in the summer, that's where the main crop figs are going to form. And those aren't going to ripen in all likelihood outdoors. So very often on a fig tree grown outdoors, you'll see in late autumn, you'll see modest sized figs on there that they haven't achieved their full size, and there's no time left for them to ripen before winter comes. Might as well remove them, because they're just taking energy and not doing anything useful with it. So unless you've got a warm spot, maybe if you've got a south facing wall, you can put a fig there and you may get better results. But if you've got a cooler spot outdoors, if you want to get any of the first crop, it's probably a good idea to give them some protection, and you're not that likely to get ripe fruit from the main crop. Undercover, potentially a different story. So we've got some of this Braber crop showing up. I'll show you a few examples and that'll be it. So these are just starting to develop. This one hasn't made a lot of progress. It's a little bit bigger, I think, than when it overwintered. They are pretty small as they head into winter, but that's what you're getting. There's no growth below here. There's nothing, and there never will be. This is useless below this point. I'll get one or two figs from the tips of the branches that are here now, and then I'll get more hopefully, from the new growth that's going to emerge in the next 2 months or so. But after that, again, these will start to form to go through the winter, and so it goes on. A slightly more mature specimen here. This is well on its way. This is a dark fig. This is Rouge de Bordeaux. Absolutely beautiful. Sort of deep red inside and a very dark purplish, bluish purpley skin. Very rich flavour like honey. It is absolutely delicious. Hopefully we're going to get a good specimen here. The main crop figs do tend to be better quality than the first ones, so we're not going to see those until the autumn. This is fairly typical. We've got the old wood here that's completely useless, but it was cut back lower down, and then we've got some side branches produced. But you can see there's not a lot of activity here. It's going to be limited just to these tips, but up here we've got a little cluster of 3 young fruitlets, and hopefully we can get those. But this is right up the top of the space now, so after that fruit has appeared, I will probably pinch these out and then cut this whole branch right back somewhere much lower down to produce some new wood. Hopefully I can do that in time to maybe get some of these young figs to go through the winter, or maybe I won't. Maybe it'll be too late and it won't be time for the new growth to develop. And that is the challenge with the figs, because it doesn't matter when you're pruning, you're always going to be cutting out productive wood. You've got no choice. You can either cut it after the Braber crop has appeared, or you could cut it after the main crops appeared. But in any event, you're losing that next bit of growth where the next flush of figs are going to come from. So shouldn't really worry too much about that, but you could cut back a proportion of the branches pretty hard, sort of in rotation. So there's always something there that is potentially producing fruit whilst you're cutting some branches back to get new growth again. I've got one other fig in the greenhouse here that's got some slightly larger specimens on. That's actually a pretty big fig. That's Brogiotto Bianco. It's a green fig, pale green. It's very nice, completely different from Rouge de Bordeaux, totally different flavour profile. It's a much lighter fig. It's very pleasant. I like it, and it's similar to quite a few of the sort of pale green figs that are common, for example, in Italy, which is why I grew this one. It's not the variety that I thought it was originally. This is a much bigger fruit, far bigger than this one. Rouge de Bordeaux, it's on the small side for figs, but makes up for it in flavour. This was a bit of a random video, just some odds and ends to do with pruning and training and fruiting habits, but hopefully you may have found it helpful or interesting. Certainly the figs I find fascinating, but pruning and training, once you've mastered the techniques and understand what effect pruning is likely to have on subsequent growth and fruiting, then it's all to do with understanding the particular fruiting habit of the tree in question. And there's quite a range of habits, and that then inspires different sort of a pruning approach to each tree. And once you nail that down, all of the pruning guides you might come across start to make a lot more sense. Anyway, hopefully there was something either useful or interesting in that pile of waffle, but that is all for this video. Thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.